The Vatican Apostolic Archive maintains an accessions register that records not just what it holds, but where everything came from. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the precise period of the Tartarian cartographic erasure, the accessions pattern shows a significant influx of materials from Central Asia and the Russian territories, received through the Jesuit mission network. That network was the most sophisticated information-gathering operation of the early modern world. Its missionaries in those regions described, in surviving correspondence, an urban civilization of extraordinary sophistication, and a documentary tradition they could actually read. What they read, the archive's accessions pattern suggests, may have followed them to Rome. Let me begin with a bureaucratic fact that is not controversial. The Vatican Apostolic Archive maintains an accessions register. Every item that enters the archive is logged. The accessions register is itself a historical document of considerable interest, because it records not just what the archive holds, but where it came from, the provenance of the collection, the institutional and individual donors, whose materials the archive absorbed across 12 centuries of operation. The accessions register is not fully accessible to researchers. Parts of it are restricted in the same way and for the same stated reasons as parts of the archive itself. But the portions that have been studied by scholars with appropriate access conducting research on specific periods reveal patterns of acquisition that the standard institutional history of the archive does not fully explain. The pattern I want to focus on is the acquisition pattern of the 17th and 18th centuries, the period that corresponds, in these investigations, to the cartographic erasure of Tartaria, and the beginning of what I've been calling the inheritance period. During this period, the Vatican Archive received, through channels that the accessions register describes with a varying but always limited degree of specificity, significant quantities of materials from sources in Central Asia, in the territories of the Russian Empire, and from the network of Jesuit missions that operated in those regions. Materials described in the accessions entries with varying levels of detail: manuscripts, maps, instruments, records of correspondence with indigenous authorities. I want to be careful about what I am and am not claiming. I am not claiming that the Vatican is hiding a complete library of Tartarian texts that would rewrite human history if made public. I am claiming that the accessions pattern of the period most directly relevant to the disappearance of Tartaria from the historical record shows a significant influx of materials from the geographic region of Tartaria, received through the institutional channels most closely associated with the information networks of that region, and filed in portions of the archive whose access has been most consistently restricted. The Jesuit mission network in Central Asia and the Russian Empire in the 17th and 18th centuries was the most sophisticated information-gathering operation that Western civilization had yet produced. The Society of Jesus, by the mid-17th century, operated in China, in India, in the territories of the Russian Empire, in regions that the European cartographic tradition labeled as Tartaria. Their missionaries were scholars, linguists, astronomers, mathematicians. Their correspondence, which flowed back to Rome through an administrative network of extraordinary efficiency, contained not just theological reports, but geographical, ethnographic, astronomical, and historical observations of a quality and specificity that no other Western institution was receiving from these regions. What did the Jesuit missionaries in Central Asia and the Russian territories observe and report about the civilization that the European maps of their era labeled as Tartaria? The surviving portions of the Jesuit correspondence from this period, the portions accessible to researchers in the archives of former Jesuit colleges, and in the publicly accessible portions of the Vatican Archive, describe, with the careful empirical attention that Jesuit scholarship consistently applied to its observations, the physical infrastructure, the social organization, and the documentary traditions of the peoples they encountered in these regions. And what they describe is not the primitive or semi-nomadic population that the post-reset narrative assigns to these territories. It is an urban civilization of considerable sophistication, with architectural traditions of a quality that the missionaries, who were among the most cultured men in Europe, found remarkable and wrote about in specific terms. The architectural descriptions are the most specific part of these surviving accounts. Buildings of a scale and material sophistication that the missionaries compared explicitly to the finest buildings in Europe. Cities of an extent and organization that suggested not the temporary settlements of pastoral peoples, but the permanent infrastructure of a settled urban tradition, public facilities, fountains, open-air structures of uncertain function but evident sophistication that the missionaries described with the careful precision of scholars encountering something genuinely new to their experience. What the missionaries also described, and this is the portion of the surviving correspondence that I find most significant, was the documentary tradition of these peoples, the manuscripts, the libraries, the accumulated written record that the civilization maintained. The Jesuit missionaries were linguists and scholars who had learned to read the written traditions of China and Japan and India. When they encountered the written tradition of the Central Asian civilization, they did not dismiss it as indecipherable or primitive. Several surviving letters describe specific attempts to learn and to read the writing system, and at least 2 surviving accounts describe successful reading of specific documents. Documents described as astronomical records, as historical chronicles, as the kind of institutional documentation that a sophisticated civilization maintains about itself. These accounts survive in the accessible portions of the archive. What the accessions register suggests also survived in a different portion of the archive is the original material, the manuscripts themselves, the instruments, the maps, the documentary record that the missionaries were reading and describing in their letters. The correspondence went to Rome. Did the objects described in that correspondence follow? The accessions register, in the portions relevant to this period, suggests that they did, that the Jesuit network, which was extraordinarily efficient at moving materials as well as information back to Rome, delivered physical materials from the Tartarian territories to the Vatican Archive in the same period that the correspondence was documenting their existence. Where those materials are now, within the archive's 85 kilometers of shelving, is the question I cannot answer. The finding aids for the portions of the archive where they would most likely be held are not publicly available. The accessions entries that would most directly document their receipt are in the restricted portions of the accessions register. The scholars who have had access to the relevant portions of the archive and who have published about their research have, with a consistency that I find significant, not described finding materials of this specific character, not because they are specifically denied finding such materials, because the subject has not been the focus of their published research, because the question of what the Vatican Archive holds from the Tartarian territories in the period of the cartographic erasure has not been a subject of organized scholarly inquiry. The archive is vast. 85 kilometers of shelving, 12 centuries of acquisition. The materials I'm describing, if they exist in the form the accessions pattern suggests, are a portion of that vast collection. They are not obviously labeled. They are not in the finding aids. They are in the part of the archive that is organized by provenance and period, rather than by subject, which means they are where the Jesuit Central Asian mission materials of the 17th and 18th centuries are, which is a specific location within the archive's physical organization. A location that is within the archive's technically accessible sections, not in the sealed areas, but in a section whose physical bulk and whose finding aid deficiencies make systematic search practically equivalent to impossibility. The Vatican Archive is not a conspiracy. It is a library, a very large, very old, very imperfectly organized library that received materials from the most geographically extensive institutional network in early modern history, and that has been organizing and providing access to those materials for 140 years since its opening to qualified researchers. The imperfection of its organization, the gaps in its finding aids, the sections that are accessible in principle but practically unreachable, are the result of 12 centuries of accumulation and the genuine difficulty of managing a collection of that scale. They are not the product of design. They are the product of history. But the specific pattern of what is imperfectly organized, what is in the finding aid gaps, what is in the sections that are accessible in principle but practically unreachable, is not random. The materials most relevant to the most sensitive historical questions, the materials from the most sensitive periods and the most sensitive geographic regions, are systematically the materials whose access is most difficult. Not impossible, not sealed, just buried under the weight of 12 centuries of accumulated documentation, in sections whose finding aids have never been adequately developed, in portions of the collection that receive the least research attention, because the questions they might answer are the questions that the scholarly consensus has agreed are not productive to ask. The Tartarian manuscripts, if they are where the accessions pattern suggests they might be, have been in the archive for 300 years. They have survived every catastrophe that has destroyed other records. They are in the most physically secure and institutionally protected archive in the Western world. They are not going anywhere. The question of when they will be found, when someone will ask the right question of the right portion of the finding aids, when a researcher with the right background and the right access and the right framing of the question will encounter them and understand what they are, is not a question of possibility. It is a question of when the scholarly consensus will decide that the question is worth asking. And scholarly consensuses change, slowly, reluctantly, under the pressure of evidence that the existing consensus cannot absorb. The evidence is accumulating. The pattern of the accessions register, the surviving Jesuit correspondence with its specific architectural and documentary descriptions, the cartographic record of the territory the correspondence describes, the architectural evidence in the surviving buildings of that territory, all of it pointing towards the same conclusion, that the civilization the maps called Tartaria left a documentary record, that the documentary record was observed and in some cases collected by the most sophisticated information network of the early modern period, and that some of what was collected is in a library in Rome on 85 kilometers of shelving, waiting for someone to look in exactly the right place with exactly the right question. The archive is open. The question is not whether the materials are accessible. The question is whether we are ready to understand what we might find. If the Jesuit missionaries who encountered Tartaria's documentary tradition in the 17th century described it in letters that survived, and if the physical materials they were reading were sent to Rome through a network of extraordinary logistical efficiency, what is sitting in the Vatican's 85 kilometers of shelving in sections whose finding aids have never been adequately developed.
Leave your thoughts in the comments and share this if you think the question of what the archive holds has never been seriously enough pursued.